Welcome to module 2.1.2. This is going to be the hydrologic cycle and moving into soil water. And so I find that soil water is probably one of the most important roles of soil other than providing the nutrients, but the water is how the nutrients get into the plant, and plants don't grow without water. So this is probably one of the fundamental key components of plant growth and land management in relation to soils. The water cycle, although this graphic may look a little difficult, there's a lot going on, but for the most part, rainfall falls, and then there is some runoff into our water bodies, and then there's evaporation, and that cycle basically continues over and over again. So there are different, we have precipitation, runoff, and then evaporation, and then there are some other minor components to the water cycle, that are kind of important to understand a little bit about. As far as water goes, one of the big problems that we have is that water cannot be created or destroyed. And so the water that we have on this earth is the only water that we have on this earth. And so if it's stored in places that we cannot access that, such as, if it were in glaciers, then, that water is unavailable to us. And so we would need those temperatures to rise so that ice could melt and then be distributed across the earth. The residency times and where we can expect that soil or, where that water is going to kind of be located, lakes and rivers. We have about a month. So once rainfall happens, we have about a month to store that. And then, every 10 days, eventually that atmosphere is changing and moving. And, many of us are aware that the weather patterns are changing. And while we still get the same amount of rainfall, it is not abundant and well distributed. So it's important to understand kind of what a watershed is, because this is our our water bank account. And so this area has, a system of streams and elevation, and, higher elevation runs to lower elevation. That's where the water goes into the streams, and then ultimately out some lower elevation of that watershed into a different area. And so these watersheds, there are several watersheds in Tennessee, and then there are several watersheds within each state. And so for us, I believe we are somewhere either in the Cordell Hull or in the Caney Fork River watershed. And so this is ultimately, all of these are somewhat, flown to the Tennessee River, or maybe even over to the Mississippi, and ultimately out into the Gulf of Mexico. So we have these water resource regions, and each region has a certain number of people that are over that kind of monitor what the inputs and the outputs are, how much rainfall and precipitation they received, how much has left their particular water resource region, and where that is going, and kind of give a water distribution. So again, I liken this to a bank account. So we know how much water came in, we know how much is leaving, how much is being used for crops, how much is stored in the soil, how much is evaporating, how much is in our waters and our lakes. And so ultimately, the majority of the center of the United States is in this Mississippi River basin, and all of that is going to end up flowing into the Gulf of Mexico. Well, one of the issues with that is that all the contamination that is in those watersheds also flows into the Gulf of Mexico. And so I am from this is actually home for me. The Gulf of Mexico is home. I grew up there. At Mississippi State, this is known as the Mississippi Delta, and this is a very large agricultural productive region. However, most of this is also agricultural productive. We're growing a lot of corn in Minnesota and Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin. And so all of this runs down. So we basically get all of the nutrients and all of that contamination from these various watersheds that end up in the Gulf of Mexico and create this hypoxia zone. And so this is going to be something that you'll likely hear when we talk about we're trying to improve the environment because ultimately this goes into the bottom and there's a lot of fish kill, and this causes a big environmental issue. Just a bigger look at how far that hypoxia zone and that contamination, and also this green area, this is going to be where a lot of our production is coming from and a lot of our nitrogen. So long term, and then down the road, like when we get into module 3, we're thinking about for our nutrient stewardship and how do we minimize this contamination into our waterways. So for our water balance equation, this is no different than, like I said, a bank account, in that our precipitation, or what is in the atmosphere, is determined by the evapotranspiration, so the amount of water that is evaporated or transpired from either water bodies or plants, and we'll discuss this in a few slides. The rainfall that is stored in the soil, and then finally, what is discharged? And by discharge, we mean what actually makes it back to the stream, what doesn't stay in the watershed, right? So this is what evaporates, this is what stays, this is what actually exits in the form of liquid. All right, so next we have these different fates, and the fate of the precipitation, or possibly the irrigation. And so the first fate is going to be interception. And interception is water hitting some object, whether it be a tree or a building, or it is not flowing straight to the soil. Next, we have infiltration. And infiltration is what makes it into the soil. If it doesn't make it into the soil, then it runs off. Once it makes it into the soil, how much is there for soil storage? And then hopefully, ultimately, enough water makes it through and continues to move through the soil profile that it enters the groundwater. And once it enters the groundwater, well, then that's what humans use in order to survive. And so if water is not making it through the soil profile into the groundwater, then we're about to have a big problem, because I really see this happening because we don't have a lot of rainfall. And if we do have a lot of rainfall, it happens in a very short period of time. So you heard me use the term abundant and well distributed. So we still get about 60 inches of rainfall in Tennessee, but we haven't had a lot of rainfall lately. And so that's not distributed very well. We typically get 2 or 3 inches, maybe in one day, rather than 2 or 3 inches over the course of a week, which would be more ideal. All right, so within interception, there are 3 components. We have stem flow, through fall, and canopy drip. So the 3 components of interception are going to be stem flow, through fall, and canopy drip. And each one of these really impacts the movement of water into the soil profile. And we'll see this in a moment. So interception is mostly dependent upon, this interception is going to be where the water hits some leaf structure. The things that are going to influence that are going to be like leaf type and canopy, potentially wind speed, the temperature, and the humidity. So there are just a couple of different things that are, a part of interception that really influence how much water makes it to the soil. So stem flow is when the water hits the leaf and then travels down the stem and that stem flow, that water goes to the trunk of the tree. And we can see where that water enters the soil, and this is where that water will remain so that the tree can then use that. And so deciduous trees, those that lose their leaves, have more stem flow than coniferous trees. And so if you think about this, think about an oak tree versus a pine tree. The chances that rainfall hits an oak leaf are greater than the chances that rainfall hits a pine needle and moves down to the trunk of that tree. And we'll see this in the next slide. So look at the shape of these deciduous trees. There's a lot of surface area for that rainfall to actually hit. And so, which tree would you rather get under during a rainstorm? An oak tree, or maybe this, what is this? This looks like some larch or some Atlas cedar. Like, you're not going to get a lot of protection from this, right? That rainfall is still going to fall through those branches. There's not enough surface area for interception, and you're probably still going to get rained on pretty good. So deciduous trees are going to have greater stem flow compared to coniferous trees. Next, we have throughfall. So we would suspect that there's greater throughfall in coniferous than there are in deciduous. So, throughfall is just that precipitation that passes through the canopy. This is indicated by these yellow lines, and that is what actually makes it to the ground. So this is going to be important, and ground cover is going to be important because we don't want this rainfall hitting this ground head on. Eventually, we will run into soil erosion. We'll get runoff, and if it runs off, then it's not in the soil. So the throughfall is going to be important. This is also going to supply soil to those specific tree roots. But also when I think about interception, I am also going to be kind of looking towards when I think about things like our regular crops, our cover crops. So even just let's say maybe a hay field. And so the more plant populations that you have there, the greater the interception will be. And if you can intercept more rainfall, you can slow the movement of that water into the soil. So interception, we have we have stem flow, we have throughfall, and we have canopy drip. And so canopy drip is what kind of, a little bit of it gets intercepted, but it also makes it onto the edge of that tree. And so at the edge of the tree, that's about the amount of where the roots are going to be. So that rainfall that happens at the edge of that canopy is going to supply greater water to those tree roots. So ultimately, anything that we can have on the ground that is going to slow the movement of that rainfall and allow that to infiltrate into our soil is going to be important. Which leads us to infiltration. And so the movement of water into that soil layer, and this is going to get us into the next module of actual soil water, where we're talking about the movement of gravity or possibly capillary action. That's all based on the soil porosity. And so this is where total pore space comes into play. So when we're thinking about these physical properties that influence soil porosity, and you're going to hear these several times in this module, but kind of the same thing that go along with plant growth. The texture is going to influence that. So this is where module 1 and that soil physical property really comes into play. What is the structure? Is it granular? Is there enough pore space? Is there enough opportunity for that water to move through the soil? Or is it platy? And if it's platy, remember that water takes the path of least resistance and it cannot move down, so it must move sideways. And if it moves sideways, it's not moving down. If it's not moving down, it's not making it into the groundwater. Bulk density, because obviously bulk density is a measure of the amount of pore space that we have in that soil. And then finally, organic matter content. And organic matter content is really going to kind of act as like a sponge that is going to separate some of those places and kind of give us some room. And also, it's going to give us some room in that soil porosity, but it's also going to have its own water holding capacity. So the physical properties, texture, structure, bulk density, and organic matter content. So this is where those components of Module 1 actually come into play. Next, we have runoff. And so if it doesn't make it into the soil, then it runs off. And you're probably, you might hear this be used as, or hear the term overland flow. And so when rainfall intensity is greater than the infiltration rate, we have runoff. When rainfall intensity is greater than the infiltration rate, we have runoff. So some of the things that we do for that are going to be adding a ground cover, applying a buffer strip so that we can minimize the movement of water off of our property. And in some instances, tillage can actually increase our infiltration rate. Now, we don't want to do tillage a lot, but every once in a while, if we get pans or we have a compacted soil, tillage would be one way that we could increase that to increase our infiltration rate. Another thing that is going to influence how much water is available to the plant is going to be this relationship with this soil, plant, and atmosphere continuum. And so as part of that water cycle, water is going to fall from the sky, added to the soil, and then water will always seek a place, this water potential gradient, always looking for areas of more negative pressure. So this is a form of pressure that we'll talk about in the next submodule. But ultimately, because water is seeking this, moving from area of high content to low content, which is also the same thing when you think about rainfall. Like there's a reason that the water falls from the sky is because there's an area of high content. The moisture in the atmosphere is so great that it finally falls out. And so that as that plant, as that water moves into the plant, not only is the plant trying to take it up, but water is also being kind of sucked up through this straw because it's trying to find the path of least resistance and complete that water cycle. So moving up out of the plant. So water moving from the soil that has the nutrients in it into the plant, and then water going out the stomata and leaving behind those nutrients, so that if we don't have any water in the soil, then the plants don't take up any nutrients. And if the plants don't take up any nutrients, then they don't grow. So the effects of this water stress, and we've seen this, that if there's not enough water being applied, those plants will start to kind of wilt. And when there's no water, we have evaporative cooling. So the plant, like pretty much all the plant metabolic processes pretty much stop because they know, the plant kind of recognizes that it cannot continue to perform these functions without water. So photosynthesis is going to slow down, plant growth is going to decrease, and we're going to be in a world of hurt. So next we have the difference between evaporation and transpiration. And so evaporation is water that is moved from or converted from a liquid form to a vapor form from a water body. So that if you had a bucket of water sitting out in the open, eventually that water would evaporate. If you were to spill water on a table and not wipe it up, eventually that water would evaporate. So it has to be from a water body. Next, we have transpiration. And transpiration is when it passes through a membrane or a pore. And so this is going to be water moving through up the plant and then out the stoma, or the stomata. Stomata. And the way that I like to kind of give this as like something that's related to humans is that when we have water and we sweat, that is transpiration. We are transpiring. And so in Mississippi, we have high humidity. And so when that water comes out of our pores, it stays there because the water needs to go from area of high content to low content. So in Mississippi, it's very humid, even more humid than it is here in Tennessee. And that water that is transpiring out of our pores will stay there because it cannot evaporate, and because once it comes out of the pores, then it will evaporate. However, if you've been to anywhere out west, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, maybe even California, their atmosphere is very dry. So you might hear them talk about it's a dry heat, but 115 is 115. I don't care where you go. But the difference is that we are allowed to, because the atmosphere is so dry, when we transpire, we are actually cooling ourselves. And so because there's not enough moisture in the atmosphere in Arizona, water moving from areas of high content to low content, that is actually transpiring through the membrane. So evaporation is from a water body. Transpiration is through a membrane. Okay, so the way that we kind of measure this is we had this potential evapotranspiration. So this is kind of the way that we compare or kind of understand, try to understand how fast we expect to lose this water before our plants can get to it. And so, we have these evaporation pans. We have plenty of research has been done that densely vegetated areas transpire about 65% compared to an open pan. So think about how much water actually moves through a plant versus how much water would be evaporated from a pan. And we'll see this evaporation pan in the next slide. But that potential evaporation is going to be about 65% of what we would normally expect from an open pan. So some of the factors that are going to affect that are going to be like climate. So obviously the temperature, relative humidity is going to be important because how much moisture is in the atmosphere is going to determine how much evapotranspiration that we have. And wind speed is something that we might not consider, that there's kind of this boundary layer over our leaves, or I'm just going to use my arm as an example. And you have to think about that, if we had a fan blowing over our arm as that water was trying to, transpire through our pores, that water would not sit on, the surface of our arm because there would be this wind speed that is kind of breaking that boundary layer and making that movement. Our plant characteristics, how deep is the root? How much water can that plant take up from the soil? How long does that plant grow? Leaf morphology, things of that nature. And then most importantly, crop type. And so obviously that summer crops are going to have a greater or higher potential evaporation transpiration value than winter crops because it's so hot that they need to move that water in order to cool themselves. All right, so here's a look at our evaporation pan. There are some calculations that we can do to determine how much water is there and then how much we lost, and we can use that to determine our potential evaporation by multiplying that times this 0.65. So we would measure how much water we have in here. There would be a time that we would measure that, typically daily, and we would measure the volume of that evaporation pan. We would know how much is actually evaporating through some calculations, and then we would multiply that times 0.65. All right, and so here's just a look at if you were really trying to do some serious, sometimes you might see these on the sides of roads, right? Because they want to know what the water flow is, how much water is being moved out. You might see these weather stations all throughout as you're driving. I know there's one right down on the creek. If you're headed to Shipley Farm, looking over to the left, right as you pass that red barn, there's a little weather station down there that monitors some of these things. Not so much that you need to know a lot of these values, but we are interested in this water use efficiency. And so because we know how much plants are going to transpire, we know how much water that we're delivering them, we know how much water they need in order to produce dry matter, which is our yield, then we can start to determine how effective our plants are, at using the water. Some of the things that are going to influence that are going to be, how many leaves in each one of those stomata are giving off or are releasing some water back into the atmosphere. How well does the plant insulate against that moisture loss? Can we reflect some of that solar radiation? A few of our climate aspects, and then finally, how much water is being supplied. Next, one of the things is going to be how much solar radiation is being absorbed. And so the more solar radiation that is absorbed, leaves can then reduce that soil surface evaporation. However, we'll get an increase in plant transpiration. So this is where this ET comes into play, because you're going to give up one for the other. So while absorbing that solar radiation might minimize the evaporation, it will also increase plant transpiration. And so the greater leaf area index, or leaf area per unit of land area, if you can think about a soybean leaf or your hands, if you were to take both of your hands and open them, open your palms as wide as you could, and then placed one palm over the other, the leaf area would increase in that particular area of land, or whatever your area is, like on your desk. If you were to put your hand over your mouse pad and that was a leaf, and put another leaf over the top of that, then your leaf area index would increase. And again, we're going to have some trade-off with evaporation and transpiration. Some of the other things are going to be our climatic conditions, our plant cover, water use efficiency, and then how long the season is and how long the growth period of that plant will be. So some of the ways that we can minimize that are going to be obviously going to want to have more cover, whether it be a cover crop or whether it be some type of mulch, so that we minimize or have a barrier between the atmosphere and the moisture that is in the soil. So that's going to be very important as we move into soil water, making sure that there's some barrier that is going to kind of keep our soil moisture high so that we have more water available to the plants. So some other benefits that we might get from that are going to be reduced weed growth. We're going to change some of our soil temperatures, which is going to be beneficial for our roots. We're going to increase water infiltration. You may see this like you'll see pine straw around the edges of trees, or maybe some of those bags that are going to capture some of that rainfall and then keep that surface area around that tree have that separation. And that as that breaks down, that organic matter is going to increase water holding capacity and supply those nutrients. And so the main reason that we want to do this is we are trying to minimize at least the water loss to the atmosphere, but we can also have water loss through the soil profile. And while this is not going to be a major issue, as it is compared to evaporation, it is still important. And so we have percolation. So percolation is movement through the soil profile. We can have percolation loss. And leaching is when we have that loss of those nutrients or chemicals from the soil. So percolation loss is just water movement through the soil. That leaching loss is when we also bring the nutrients with it. So we can have water loss from the soil to both the atmosphere and then also through the soil profile. Now, if we don't get enough water into the soil, then we won't have as much percolation loss. So we don't have as much percolation loss in the summertime as we do in the wintertime. Okay, so that's going to end it for module 2.1.2. In the next cycle, we'll continue on in the next module, we'll continue on talking about percolation loss and then kind of movement into the groundwater. So movement through the soil profile.